economy. She also works on a million other things and has written for everywhere. I'm shortening these a little bit, but yeah, is an editor at Jacobin, has written for Dissent, N+1, et cetera, et cetera. To my left is Kate Aronoff. Kate Aronoff is a writing fellow in These Times magazine and a contributing writer for The Intercept, where she covers American politics and the politics of climate change. Kate previously worked for the New Economy Coalition and is currently pursuing a master's degree in econ at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and has also written for basically everywhere. And all the way to my far left is Michelle Miller. This joke never gets old. Michelle Miller is the co-founder of coworker.org, a digital platform for worker voice. Since its founding in 2013, coworker.org has supported worker organizing to shift power at companies like Starbucks, REI, Wells Fargo, and Comcast. She is a 2014 Echoing Green Global Fellow, many other fellowships, and yeah, I don't know how much this. Yeah, no, and has also written a ton of amazing stuff. So I won't give you can find longer descriptions of all of our bios, including my own, in I think a packet that's circulating. But without further ado, I think I should hand it off to Alyssa to get us started.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out. Thank you obviously to everyone who has put a lot of work into organizing this. It's been really terrific so far, and I'm really happy and excited to be on this panel. The second thing I want to say is, of course, happy birthday to Marx, but also thank you to Marx's mother, Henriette Pressburg, who delivered him into the world 200 years and one day ago. So, thanks for that. I think their relationship grew strained over the years, but she tried to, it's challenging to be a mother sometimes. And so there are clearly, I think, a lot of things that one could say about Marx in relation to capitalism, technology, and ecology. He talks about machinery and automation at length, and his descriptions of machinery can be quite stunning, really. He wrote about agriculture and soil fertility, and of course the metabolic rift. He was interested in chemistry and physics and the lessons that they held for socialists. He talks about primitive accumulation and the seizure of the commons and the means of subsistence. So there are many, I guess, ways into it. Of course, these aren't, they're often, they can be conflicting, and I think for many Marxists, it's not been clear how to think about the relationship between technology and ecology in particular. Is technology a means of liberating humans from the constraints of necessity and eking out a harsh living from, an unfriendly nature? Or is it a means of dominating nature towards capitalist ends that we should, seek to we shouldn't actually aim for this kind of domination, even of non-human nature. And so I think there are a lot of questions, and I think you could plausibly use Marx to argue different aspects. Yes, as of course Ajay just noted for us. But rather than doing some kind of exegesis, I'm going to talk about some questions about what I think about in terms of the relationship of technology, ecology, and capitalism in the contemporary moment. And my approach draws from socialist feminist thinkers like Donna Haraway, Sylvia Federici, Shulamith Firestone, who think about both different kinds of labor under capitalism, but also the ways in which technologies can be liberatory in ways, and that, how we can complicate our relationship to nature and to capitalism. And so I'm going to think through, in particular, so I've sort of two things that I want to talk about, but I might only get through one of them. And those are, first, so in my work, I tend to think about the place of ecosystemic activity under capitalism in relation to feminist theories of social reproduction. So how we think about this kind of background activity that's necessary to reproduce life, against which the production of commodities occurs. And I think people like John Bellamy Foster, Jason Moore, and others have shown that Marx thought about these things, but they weren't quite central to his thought. They were certainly not what he spent most of his time thinking about, but they are a significant thing we should think about. What is the work of an ecosystem? How do we think about that in our theories of capitalism? But what I want to talk about is how we think about technologies in relation to that, technologies of what we might call ecological reproduction. and whether and how we imagine intervening in the ecosystems that keep our planet habitable. And of course, people like Haraway and Firestone in particular have written about reproductive technologies with regard to human bodies and how we control our own reproductive systems. So I'm kind of curious whether and how we think about this in relation to this sort of ecosystemic work. And then if I have time, I might talk a little bit about what kind of modernity we imagine eco-socialism, because I think we sometimes get into this like either Prometheanism, like eco-modernism, sees all, fully automated luxury communism, sees all the machines and have a world of abundance for all through the use of this machinery and technology to produce more and more, or like a just, kind of neo-romanticism, and I would like to not be stuck in those poles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about whether and how we can imagine a low modernist eco-socialist future. But first, so thinking about ecosystemic technologies and the problem of making a living. When we think about eco-technologies and green tech and clean tech and so on, I think that people tend to think about technologies that try to reduce the impact of production and that use fewer, particularly non-renewable resources. So things like solar panels that would substitute the use of renewable sunlight instead of using coal or oil. Or the electric car or something like that. That's supposed to reduce the impact of production on the earth. Historically, a lot of environmental concern has been premised on the idea that we're going to run out of resources like coal, oil, minerals, and so on. And a lot of economists, mainstream economists, will say, well, there aren't really, these like natural resource limits aren't a real threat to growth because natural resources and man-made ones are substitutable. So you can invent technologies that will stand in for natural resources and shift production or shift what kinds of inputs you're using. And that these are 100% substitutable. So there's nothing that occurs out in nature that you couldn't figure out, like another thing that people can either make or find another kind of resource. That's been a major sort of debate around like a lot of the classic resource scarcity questions. This rarely gets into the question of what about non-renewable resources? Can you substitute, for the renewable and constantly renewing work of ecosystem activity, the kind of ecosystemic activity that's critical to keeping the planet habitable? And this is where the biosphere comes in. Finally, my PowerPoint. I found there's like a lot of fun images throughout this, but starting with the biosphere. So the biosphere is a concept first developed by the Soviet scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, who actually called it the noosphere, but it's basically come to, we now know this is the biosphere, and it's the layer of the planet that's capable of supporting life, and that's made up of various ecosystemic functions that produce an atmosphere and a sort of set of systems that in which people and other kinds of species can live. Other planets do not, so far as we know, have a biosphere. It is our one here. So that's what the biosphere is. This is ours. It's the planet, or this layer of the planet. There are many levels of the planet that are not the biosphere, as far as we know. So I think the question is, I'm going to be looking at or talking a little bit about this example of a project that was aiming not to just sort of curb overconsumption, but to create another biosphere, which is Biosphere 2 in Tucson, Arizona. And this is a project in the late 80s and early 1990s to build an artificial and functional biosphere in Arizona, where the idea was to build this closed system that people could live in semi-indefinitely, living off the food they grew, and they had a number of different ecosystems, like a rainforest, a savanna. You can see some of them here, marsh, desert, and so on. The lung over here is a nice sort of, they often just refer to the sort of biosphere as like the life support system of Earth, but it's often quite literalized in terms of like body parts. So this is this project that was intended to be a way to see that if an ecosystem was itself something that could be man-made and engineered in some way, and whether people could create this livable space. And the reason people were doing this was it was based off of, inspired by, in part, these ideas of space colonization, space settlement, space, different, people call it by different terms, and there's been obviously a lot of discussion of whether we should call it even space, living in space colonization, if we should come up with a different term. But this is what, Gerard O'Neill and many others did use. Anyway, so the biosphere was like, how can we create this kind of, closed system that we can then launch out into outer space and live in. And so, as one of Jane Poynter, who's one of the scientists on this project, later put it, we needed to know, is life this malleable? Is life, something that people can shape enough to actually be able to create a sort of new system for life? And so, this was the sort of problematic they laid out: how to colonize other planets or survive ecological catastrophe. And this one, so motivated both by this space exploration, but also even 25, almost 30 years ago, a sort of anxiety around ecological catastrophe. This is their sort of, they had these little suits. Awesome. Yeah, they were designed apparently by Marilyn Monroe's dress designer, and obviously are sort of going on a, neo-Star Trek aesthetic. It's pretty nice. But what was actually going on, so, they have this whole, we're building the biosphere, but it's built on top of a massive technosphere. I kind of compiled some images to create, sorry, I'm pointing at this. I should be pointing at this. So Poynter calls this the Garden of Eden on top of an aircraft carrier. And this is the, huge amount of technological stuff that they had to use to build a set of, artificial systems that although populated with actual animals and insects and plants and things like that, still had to kind of recreate some version of biochemical cycles. And it wasn't quite the Garden of Eden. They lived inside it for 2 years, grew 80% of their food, lost a lot of weight, had a lot of fights, lost a lot of oxygen, and so had a hard time, sleeping and breathing and things like that. Eventually, they had to pump it. It was supposed to be completely closed, where they were not going to insert any new anything from the outside, but they had to because they were losing so much oxygen. It was that or shut it down. The carbon dioxide levels rose very fast, and they tried to figure out what to do with that. They tried to sequester carbon by growing plants, but then whenever they tilled the soil, the carbon would be re-released. They couldn't really figure out how to stop carbon from accumulating within this closed cycle, unfortunately. A lot of the species, 30 to 40% of the species died off. They were plagued by ants and cockroaches and other kinds of things. After 2 years, the original crew left the Biosphere 2 on schedule. They're like, oh, we're gonna run this for 100 years and have new crews for 50 new crews for 2 years each for 100 years. That did not happen. This was the only crew that ever went in. And it's been kind of hard to assess what, it was both kind of looked at as a stunt that went totally wrong and kind of trashed as a total failure. And then now people are like, well, but we learned something about the carbon cycle and so on. We certainly did learn that it's very hard to just create a new ecosystem. There's a lot that we don't know how to, we don't both understand about how they work, but certainly about how to recreate them. So I think, which I'll say a bit more about in a minute, but to be clear, this was definitely not a socialist project or even a governmental one. It was actually run by a company called the Space Biospheres Ventures, a company funded by a Texas oil billionaire, Edward Bass, who actually also funded the Bass Library at Yale, where I'm in school. So it cost $150 million to build. They imagined it as a profit-making venture. They were going to charge people, well, they did charge people $13, which now is probably around $25. 500,000 people actually came and saw it and kind of would walk around looking into the biosphere, and it was seen as a kind of Big Brother type thing. You could watch the crews inside interacting and so on. It didn't make any money, so Bass fired most of the staff while the crew was still inside. There was a huge mess. Steve Bannon came in to manage the cost overruns. He was working for an investment bank, and they sent in him to restructure the finances. He eventually brokered a deal with Columbia to take over the lease and the property and use it as an actual laboratory. Some crew members sued for back pay. There were a bunch of lawsuits and lots of acrimony. And, so this was definitely a failed capitalist venture that I don't really know what they were like, it's a tourist attraction, but also presumably at some point they would sell this tech to NASA or something. Who knows? It didn't work out for them. And I think, it's still, of course, a fantasy of capitalism in some way. We now have, despite this, kind of failure of figuring out how to live on another planet, we now have, our friend Elon Musk saying, well, I'm going to save humanity by colonizing Mars, and the only way we can not go extinct here on this planet is to become a spacefaring multiplanetary species. He's done this absolutely hideous thing. This is like the most cursed image in my opinion. It's so bad. We're going to Mars with like a Tesla car. Last night Anwar Sheikh said it's probably harder to build socialism than to go to Mars. And, I think that's probably true, but I think it's probably very hard to live on Mars. And that's actually a question that I think actually is pretty pertinent to socialism in an age of ecological catastrophe. Because, what it takes to live on Mars is not that different from, or understanding what it would take to live on Mars is also pertinent to what it will take to live on Earth and how we can figure out what kinds of, how we understand our own planet, and what kinds of, I think the kinds of things we would need to know to actually live on Earth will be quite relevant to how we imagine maintaining, regenerating, restoring our own planet, which is going to need quite a lot of that, in my opinion. Of course, it's not, so this is the Elon Musk colony dream. Of course, the obvious rejoinder to that is that we have had sort of the socialist daydream on this side too, and Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy tries to imagine how you could terraform Mars in a sort of more utopian way and make it into a livable planet. To be clear, he was recently interviewed in these Times, and he was very clear that the Elon Musk dream is completely absurd, and in fact that I think this is a scientific or a sci-fi fantasy, we should not put our eggs in the basket of living on Mars, or figuring out how we do that as the safeguard for what we do on Earth. Again, I don't think you have to go all the way to the living on Mars question or to Biosphere 2, to creating an entirely artificial biosphere, to be thinking about the questions of how we are intervening in shaping and trying to figure out how we can create ecosystems and ecosystemic relationships that we can live with on our planet. And I think there are a lot of different versions of this. I guess the lower tech versions are things like rewilding and a lot of ecological restoration projects and building parks and certain kinds of biotech. I think all you can see as potential ways that we are thinking about technology in relation to the work of ecological reproduction, which is, I think, one of the most crucial questions for socialists in the years to come. I have talked long enough, so I will leave out my low modernism thing. Well, we can talk about it maybe in the Q&A if people are very excited about that. So but now I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you. Kate?
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do if we don't want to live on Mars. Thematically on theme. And thinking about what I was going to say for this, kind of like Alyssa mentioned, there's a lot of sort of inroads into thinking about Marx in relationship to the planet and ecology. And one thing I think is really useful that comes from Marx is an ability to think about technology as not just this progression of sort of innovation along a sort of neutral path that just happens as time goes on, but actually as a product of social relations and as something which, I'll use dialectics. Maybe people will yell at me for that. I haven't, maybe been to enough grad school to use it properly. But there's this really interesting interplay between humans and technology that we've seen over time, and in particular in the history of fossil fuels. That's something that's come up sort of again and again. So Timothy Mitchell, historian, has done a lot of work on this, sort of pointing out kind of how the early history of coal coincided with sort of demands for things like a shorter work week, for the abolition of child labor, and that was because the sort of coal production process lent itself to unions, to the growth of trade unions, by having people sort of together in close proximity, and coal transportation sort of relied on these supply chains, most of which involve trains, and if you have a bunch of Teamsters, it's very easy to shut down a train line and prevent coal from getting from point A to point B. And so naturally capital was not very happy about this, and this isn't necessarily a direct line, I wouldn't want to say, but part of the story of the transition over to oil and how oil became so popular, again, this is his argument, I'm not saying anything terribly new here, was that you could build pipelines, and that sort of got rid of the problem of workers sort of getting in the way of fossil fuel production and transportation. And so I think that kind of level of thinking hasn't been, I haven't seen it extended as naturally into solar and wind production and sort of renewables, and kind of what is the labor political economy of renewable energy. And I'm not actually going to talk too much about that, but all it's to say is that I think that renewable energy and sort of the process of decarbonization, of making sure that our productive processes aren't as bound up in toxic supply chains, that is often framed as a technical question, right? And so considering that sort of being sort of earnest historical materialists in the 21st century means looking at kind of the full range of what fuels sort of society in a broad sense of the word. I mean, Andreas Malm sort of points out that the English language, I think, is the only language maybe where the words for power mean many different things. So power is in political power, power is in kind of what turns the lights on, and those two things are not, that's not necessarily a coincidence. And so what I want to talk about is kind of, as we're thinking about this really urgent problem of decarbonization, how do we transition off of fossil fuels and our sort of near complete dependence on them right now, what else needs to be considered? And so I'm a reporter, I end up looking a lot at climate policy, and so there's been sort of various waves of what's kind of in vogue in climate policy. And so a few years ago that was cap and trade. Now the sort of center-left demand seems to be around 100% renewable energy, and getting to 100% renewable energy. There was a bill introduced, I think last year, by Bernie Sanders, and I think it was Sanders, a crew of sort of progressive legislators on Capitol Hill. And there have been versions of this in state legislatures and elsewhere. And that really doesn't, it's true, right? Like that we need 100% renewable energy, but there are all these sort of other implications of what decarbonization means that don't get sort of included in that picture. And so I want to talk a little bit about, what does that picture look like, and argue that part of what that is a rethinking of the welfare state, and how we sort of apportion benefits and think of the role of the state in people's lives and in the economy. And looking at, what does the fight over that look like, and what does the fight to build a good life look like, in some ways that are not necessarily thought of as climate demands, but I think are politically important to think about as we're thinking about, the huge technical task on the one hand, but also the huge political task of just creating the sort of will for this level of massive transformational change to the economy in the next, now. So I'm gonna sort of spend the rest of the time just talking about, what are these other pieces of decarbonization which we don't talk about, which brings me to striking teachers in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma in particular. I have not followed Arizona quite as closely, and so I'm not going to pretend to talk about that. And as you might see, it doesn't sort of fit as well into the story that I want to tell, but. With regards to West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, it's really, I don't think, a coincidence that all three of these strikes occurred in states whose economies have historically relied almost entirely, or at least very, very heavily, around fossil fuels. So West Virginia and Kentucky were both built, Eastern Kentucky in particular, their economies have both been built basically from the ground up around fossil fuels and around in Kentucky and West Virginia in particular, coal. Coal over the last several years has declined as the natural gas boom has taken off, and that's devastated the economies of West Virginia and Kentucky. And so part of having basically a petrostate is that you have very friendly tax policies toward coal companies and toward, there is a little bit of natural gas in West Virginia. There's not very much in Kentucky. We'll talk about Oklahoma in a little bit, which is sort of a wasteland of pro-industry policy. But this sort of the decline of coal has sort of cratered the tax base of these states, and so this is kind of what teachers are responding to in a way, that there simply isn't as much money as there used to be in the states to fund the public sphere. And so there's this big question there of how do you fund a public sphere in a place where that has historically been the job of the fossil fuel industry. And there are various proposals sort of on the table in both of those states. The idea has been discussed of a permanent fund in the mold of Alaska, actually after the oil crisis. Many states around the country that are resource intensive created their own permanent funds. North Dakota actually created one at the start of the fracking boom, and its education spending, I think, grew by the most of any state in the union since 2011. While Oklahoma, which still has a lot of fossil fuels, declined by I think the most of any state in the union. Basically, by virtue of these states are not kind of using what kind of resource wealth they have for the benefit of the people in their states, but almost all of those profits go to these fossil fuel corporations. And so it's been very easy in these places to make for the right to make a political argument that there is a trade-off to be made between getting rid of fossil fuels and jobs, and that is a direct sort of economic choice that has to be made. And the left's answer to that, and the green sort of left in particular, has been, well, no, it won't. And there hasn't really been a sort of way to really counter that and articulate kind of what a good life looks like that doesn't involve fossil fuels. And I think that's not as sort of talked about kind of in the in sort of the green circles and climate circles that I've been a part of, but I think is really crucial, particularly in those places whose economies have been dependent on these resources, to say, to really put forth a vision of what a low-carbon life can look like, and what a low-carbon state can look like, and what a low-carbon welfare state can look like. And that is really challenging, I think, in part because some of our models that we often look to for social democracy up through socialism have been petrostates. If you look at Scandinavian social democracies, much of that wealth comes from the sort of accumulated wealth of oil, particularly oil in places like Norway, less so in Sweden. And I won't claim to be an expert on that, but I think the existing models we have don't fully reckon with the fact that our models for building robust welfare states often do involve really sort of toxic supply chains. And so, in thinking about decarbonization and what it looks like to muster the political will, the left really does need to be sort of proactively thinking about what that looks like. And I'll talk. I don't know how much time I have.
I wasn't even measuring.
Okay, great.
Finish it off. Yeah.
So I want to talk. Well, just to sort of like wrap up that point, I think we should really be thanking teachers in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma for these strikes, which are really, teachers I've talked to, I don't think would necessarily articulate it this way, but it really is a fight to define what a low carbon world looks like, and the fight against austerity is crucial to that, because austerity is really a horrible way to respond to any sort of disaster, which brings me to Puerto Rico, where teachers were also on strike this past week. And I won't, maybe later we can get into the sort of whole history of why Puerto Rico is in the situation that it is, starting with colonialism, and you know, continuing with colonialism. What the government there has done is essentially, and the Fiscal Control Board, the sort of Washington-appointed body, they've responded to a massive unnatural disaster, I would say, Hurricane Maria, by trying to insert more austerity and less spending into the picture, which might be kind of the opposite of what you can do to recover from not just a storm, but also the kind of recession and depression, which has plagued Puerto Rico's economy for a long time. And so there's a way in which, like, the set of tools that politicians are working with, sort of across the board, both in places where the state has relied on extraction and places that are actually dealing with climate impacts, are just totally sort of ill-equipped to deal with, you know, any sort of the picture of decarbonization and kind of what the 21st century will look like, which for many places will mean more climate disasters, will mean more sort of destruction. And so in thinking about, you know, what a holistic picture for decarbonization looks like, that I think just involves many, many more questions than how do we get to 100% renewable energy. And yeah, I could list off more things, but I won't, and give the time elsewhere. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. So this morning, when I was trying to think about what I was going to say, and if I was going to be able to say it in like a sort of linear manner, I started thinking about this piece that I read back in December by the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, who was reacting to the sudden dire warnings from people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates about the coming AI, like, robot apocalypse. It's going to take us all over and do terrible things to us. And Ted Chiang's position in the piece was essentially like, well, yeah, if it acts like you, but it doesn't have to. And he really talked about it as like, the reason that they're scared of AI is because they think AI is going to act like capitalism, and it doesn't actually have to do that. And he said, I mean, who else pursues goals with a monomaniacal focus, oblivious to the possibility of negative outcomes? Who adopts a scorched earth approach to increasing market share? You. So what I loved about that was that it did really reframe these questions that we have about the growing power that artificial intelligence and algorithms and technology has in our economy to something that has the potential to actually be in our hands and to do really great things for us. But that currently the growth of technology is actually based on the logic of resource extraction. There's a lot of reason why, if you read, you know, a lot of economists right now talk about, like, data is the new oil, that a lot of the investment that most technology companies are getting is not in the production of product or not in the creation of innovation or new things, but actually finding really new, clever ways to get your data from you. And there's a huge speculation economy built on what we might be able to do with that data someday. Shoshana Zuboff explains this in a lot of the work that she's done on the idea of surveillance capitalism, that it started with tech platforms like Google and Facebook that perfected the art of taking your data and using it to sell you ads. And now they've actually figured out how to take those mechanisms that were just about data extraction for ad sales and to start to apply them to creating artificially intelligent systems that both can sort of self-perpetuate, but also continue to think of even more clever ways to get your data to sell you ads, and then also build technology that will that will automate all of the things in our lives. And so I think a lot about that in the context of worker organizing, because while it's hard and sort of amorphous in the use of consumer platforms like Google and the ways in which we in our regular lives interact with these platforms, when you are at work, you actually have an economic relationship with the technology that you're using and with the power that is implementing that technology on your life. And so is the workplace and is worker organizing a place to start contesting the power of these extractive technologies and to reclaim them for the commons and for ourselves? And so that's a little bit of what I wanted to talk about. I built an organization about 5 years ago that essentially says if we can use platforms to aggregate people to do work, then could we use platforms to aggregate them to contest power at work? If we can use the networks effects of Facebook to create, communities to send ads and to do all kinds of other things, can those communities be communities of workers who start to actually function as workers of the world, not just workers of a nation state or workers of a single entity? And so I have a lot of faith in the repurposing of the technology in order to contest that power, but we have to start thinking about the ways that companies make money and the ways that they are building their own power, as not that they're creating a bunch of products or technological innovations that we want to use, but that they're hoarding a commodity of ours, which is data. And so like a year or two ago, I started thinking about the ways in which data extraction and algorithmic manipulation take place inside the workplace in ways that we could build a labor movement that's able to respond to that and return some of the productivity to workers from that. So one very simple example is the use of productivity trackers. They watch people who work in Amazon warehouses, or people who even white collar workers at their desks, and they determine how many steps it took you to get from thing A to thing B, and they either, they never really reward you. I mean, they just pay you, or they dock you for not meeting the metrics that are set. And in that case, there's the sort of blatant exploitation of managing a person by a robot that sets artificially high standards for performance and then penalizes people for not meeting them. But there is also the fact that all of those systems are built on data that workers are contributing to it as they are performing those tasks, that are actually telling it what the bare minimum should be, and they are not compensated for any of the value of that data. And so if we even just started in those very simple ways of working with groups of workers to start to demand that they get a share of the productivity increases that result from them being managed by these systems that are run on data that they contribute in the first place, is that a place to start to create a framework where we can put value on the amount of data that's being extracted from systems, from people. And in a sort of creepier instance of this, there are a lot of, this is more in the white collar sector, but there's a lot of use of behavioral analytics software to mine you psychologically and categorize you and surveil your behavior in order to more effectively manage you. It is often positioned as a means to find high performers and reward them, or hidden influencers, which is my favorite phrase because that just means organizers. And again, this is a system that in the short term makes it possible for employers to start to not to share common gains with the commons of the workforce, but to select certain people based on their data profile for, so if you have a profile that says you are a flight risk and you might quit sometime, they're much more likely to give you a raise than someone who isn't a flight risk because maybe they're a single mother, or maybe because they're a person of color, they have less job market mobility because hiring is racist. And so it sort of reinforces hierarchies around social exclusion. It also allows for employers to be much more selective about the ways that gains in productivity get shared across workforces. And so again, if we can think about ways in which workers are demanding access to that data, that we start to treat that data as a commons, as a common resource, instead of something that is tied up and held by a few owners, those are the places where we can start to then apply that shared knowledge to building technological systems that work for everyone and aren't built on this basis of extraction. And I think a lot about this also because I think in our fever dream fantasies, post-revolution, we get all of the platforms and all of the systems and then we use them for our purposes, but they are built on exploitation. I don't want Amazon. It ain't good. And so some of the other work that we need to do in the long term is to really start thinking about the ways in which we would repurpose and rebuild, or start from scratch, the same kinds of platform and networking technologies that have been used to create monopolies and to create domination in order to create more of a global commons. And to do it from a perspective that isn't rooted in this idea of extraction but in an idea of abundance and an idea of a commons. So. Yeah.
I'm still taking notes from you. Yes, I should put my little thing up. Hold on one second. I might actually do it from over here because when I didn't realize it would be set up like this, which I should have. Play. All right. Actually, I'll skip right to the next one. So actually looking at, I know a few people here have heard me talk about some of these things before. This is a couple of like lessons or ideas from a much larger project that includes like all the political theory classics, including like, you know, what are states and do we need them? And like what could a political subject be for today? But what I want to talk about here sort of briefly are a couple paradoxes. And the sort of difficulty of the situation. I'm actually, you know, I guess it's fallen to me to do the like super dismal part of almost every ecological panel that ever happens, which is like, it's worse than you imagine. The chart you have up here to your left is the parts per million of atmospheric carbon from 1960 until April 29th, 2018. One other thing that's real charming about working on climate change is that you can literally update your data every week and it's always worse. And one of the things that, you know, I'm not going to like bury you in these fucking horror stories, but one of the things that's really interesting that one reason I wanted to start with this chart in particular is that there can be a tendency to treat climate change and global warming as a sort of add-on. And as a policy thing, like, oh, we'll just tweak that down, like 10% less carbon next year, it'll be good. Kate mentioned cap and trade, even sort of some of like carbon tax positions, things like that. It's not that simple. You know, the very famous, you know, people were really aghast when Trump removed his signature from the Paris Climate Accord, a treaty that was not worth the paper it was written on, not simply in terms of political enforcement, but literally its own goals had been failed 3 years previous to its signing. As this sort of curve goes up, you can't just nibble it down. Like if next year there was 0 carbon emissions, that shit would still go up and it wouldn't actually start going down for like hundreds, maybe even longer years. So it's not, right, these are these sort of cascading effects. It's not simply something you can tweak away. On the right-hand side of this is, this is a fun little one too. It was recently 50 degrees Celsius in this small town in Pakistan, Nawabshah, which is near 100 miles away from Karachi, which was not only the hottest day in April this year, but in fact the hottest day in April ever in all of recorded human temperature on Earth. It was about, that's about 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That is actually hotter than you can live. Like if you're just like walking around, like you will die pretty quickly. And what's interesting about this is not only just like, oh man, that's a really terrible horror story, but tons of people. This is like an area that's heavily populated, right? So if you're thinking about this not only in terms of just these sort of like raw data about ecologies, but about social systems, I mean, that's a lot of people who are gonna have to move or die in the way the world is arranged right now. That is a really brutal reality that I think very few people are sort of prepared to deal with. So, okay, that's the downer stuff. It's actually a lot of downer stuff, I'm sorry. One thing that's super, super interesting, at least to me, and Alyssa mentioned a little bit that there are this sort of like techno-optimist literature. You can sort of like build your way out of the problem, and there is like a large sort of mainstream literature that is sort of we can tweak our way out of the problem. But there is a broad range and like a weird sort of convergence among super disparate perspectives when people start digging into the natural scientific data on this problem. Like, oh shit, there's some real problems. So what I have up here on the left is probably the least famous book. This is this obscure business school text written in Australia by 2 business school professors. Starts like chapter 1, like it's like a Paul Samuelson classic Econ 101. By like chapter 5, they're Rosa Luxemburg, and by chapter 9, they're John Bellamy Foster, because they start digging into this problem and realizing that they cannot live in a growth growth-based economy anymore. There's lots of different solutions across this spectrum of books I put up here. But one thing that they all agree on is we have to change our relationship to production and our relationship to growth. Next to it is Kate Raworth's book. This is a sort of pop economics book. It's actually really quite brilliant. I highly recommend it. But again, she comes and convenes around an idea of a steady state economy and getting off of growth and productivity for a different, not abandoning development. This is not primitivism, but rather thinking about development differently, doing it differently. And on the right, we are at a Marx conference. These are some of the most famous Marxian takes on the question. And it's funny, I know Andreas Malm and Jason Moore don't think they agree on lots of things, but I actually think they do. Guys, if you're watching, it's cool. What? No, I teach these books together, and all my students see them as extremely complimentary. But the thing that's really, really, really important is that bringing a Marxian perspective can be both challenging and quite illuminating to this question. And the first big challenge, though, is that we can't, you can't do the add-on. Just like you can't do the liberal add-on, you can't do the wave the full communism wand. Full communism, and the world gets better. It doesn't solve this problem in the current way we think about production. Okay, so this is a very recent article. I'm just giving you the abstract. I'm not going to read it. You can read it, and you can find this online. It's probably paywalled, but it's from Nature. It's the Nature family of journals. This is the Nature Sustainability. It's a team of ecologists and economists. And they're sort of measuring what they call a good life for all within planetary boundaries. And it's not the prettiest picture of all time. They do think, in fact, we can get to things that are, housing, food, clothing, basic necessities for all people without a die-off. We'll talk about die-off in a little bit. Without a die-off with current production capacities. And curving things to stay within what they call planetary boundaries, meaning within livable carbon ranges, and using resources at a rate that doesn't deplete them. There's a lot more in there, but I'm trying to move quickly. However, they say high quality of life things, and in this they list things like living in a democracy. They also list things like having educational infrastructure, things like this. These are too expensive. As they say, you can see right here, 2 to 6 times more expensive than the sustainable level. So but they are using, I think it's incumbent upon Marxian thinkers, left thinkers more broadly, to take this literature seriously, even though it doesn't do what I'm about to say, because these are people who are really trying to measure the actual amounts of stuff. And this planetary, there's always been a fear in Marxist circles of Malthus, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this stuff's real. There's only a certain amount of cadmium in the world. You can't just make more of it out of a replicator. It just doesn't work that way. And why do I pick on cadmium? Because cadmium's the thing that makes your phone run. So that said, this kind of literature assumes a couple things. One, that these costs are static, right? That there's basically, it costs as much as markets deliver them for. There's only one kind of market. Last night, there was some discussion of market capitalism, market socialism. This assumes markets is one kind of thing. That's it. It also assumes there's only one kind of state. It's something I'm definitely going to want to talk about more. I mean, that Tim Mitchell book is so good because it also talks about the creation of other kinds of states. Why do we have states like Saudi Arabia, which are super weird, is part of that story as well. There's lots of different kinds of states. This assumes there's only one kind of state and that it delivers things at this cost. And this is where I think a Marxian perspective is key. This is an artificially inflated price for these high quality of life goods. And we're going to have to start thinking in this space not only about sort of communal luxury. This is a wonderful book by Kirsten Ross, came out a couple years ago about the Paris Commune, but a very old Marxist dream, also frankly an old Keynesian dream, an old even Adam Smithian dream, that temporal luxury, having more time, slowing down production, slowing down growth might be something we actually want democratically, we actually want as a political project. A few of you will have heard me do this before. This is a thought experiment I like to do when I'm giving these talks, just to sort of underline both the difficulties and some of the possibilities. So I call it thinking a surplus squeeze through a cyborg circuit. Anyone who is sort of, if your bells are going off, obviously this is a Donna Haraway-inspired thought experiment, especially her early work. But think about this like imaginary circuit, okay? You can start anywhere you like. So increased atmospheric carbon contributes to ocean temperatures rising, contributes to depletion of livelihood, and this is just one little circuit, for nearly 1 million Filipino fishermen, fishing families rather, whose labor is then double shifted along mostly gendered lines onto both migrant laborers working in petrostates in the Gulf and care workers in the United States and the EU, freeing up hyper-employed labor in advanced states to increase productivity, which in turn demands more petroenergy and more chemical inputs. As you can see, this is a pretty vicious cycle. But the other thing you have to note on here, right, is that one of the other tendencies in the literature is to try to split off or think of ecological problems without dealing sometimes with the social ramifications. But if you sort of look along this chain, right, you can see what sort of classic Marxist thinking, especially someone like Rosa Luxemburg, would see as both the sort of primitive accumulation, sites of primitive accumulation, and also sites of surplus value across everywhere, right? Two, and I actually didn't put this up here, right? Everywhere along here is also a political and social crisis, right? There's a crisis of gendered labor here. There's a crisis of politics here, right? If you think about the current politics of the United States, where I'm imagining our advanced sort of hyper-employed worker lives, or you think about the Philippines, where I'm imagining, not really imagining, where these fishing families live, these are both now run by wannabe sort of right-wing hardcore authoritarians or, honest to God, right-wing authoritarians. Those things are inextricable. So if you aren't dealing with the political and social problems, you're actually going to fail in your challenge of dealing with the ecological ones. Two, thinking back to the slide before, these costs are not quality of life costs per se. It's because we have to keep these things profitable, because we have to keep them private, and because we are wanting accumulation and growth that keeps this little cycle running. And it sort of, my last point I've already hit. It's impossible to imagine how to unravel. It becomes clear how impossible it is to unravel the social from the ecological in these crises. So my key example for today is the paradox of renewable energy. So when you read about renewable energy in, I don't know, like super mainstream publications, I don't know, New York Times, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, whatever, usually the problems are framed as technological, right? It's like inefficient turbines or the photovoltaic cells won't give us enough power. There's insufficient storage capacity. Batteries are often talked about, capacitors, things like that. But the really weird thing about this is virtually all of these technological problems have been surpassed or are pretty close. The really, really sort of funny bit of this actually jives a lot with the Biosphere story. A lot of this research was done by BP, ExxonMobil in the early 2000s. They found the stuff worked like a charm. It's fucking fantastic. There's a problem with that. It's the sort of classic name in sort of old economics literature, old political economy literature for this is a Lauderdale paradox, which is that as things get super cheap and super efficient and are incredibly abundant, it's impossible to make money off them. So we don't actually lack the capabilities to have these technologies. We lack the political will to implement them. So, and this brings me to my final highly contentious slide. So thus, while there are real planetary boundaries, our lodestar should be Marx and not Malthus, right? There are planetary boundaries, but this is about social relations. It's more about systemic stability and stressors than it is about running out of things altogether. The shift from growth-based development to sustainable redistributive development is a problem of social relations, and it is necessary. And then I have here like this list, and I will go through it real quickly, of sort of everyone's dream and misconception about this problem. Like mainstream liberal policymakers, there is no market-based solution for this problem. There just is none. Anyone who tells you there's a market-based solution for climate crisis is lying to you. 2, Marxists, sorry folks, we can't wait for the revolution or the withering of the state. Again, it's proven, the joke about it's really hard to colonize Mars, right? It's also proven pretty hard to have the world revolution. I don't know if people have noticed that. And this problem, that first chart, that goes up every single year. It doesn't stop. So we can't wait around for this, and I'll get to the state again in a moment. There's also sort of a techno-futurist, techno-optimist, the Elon Musks. There is a sort of left version of this as well, but what we want is to build ourselves into a future of shared temporal luxury, not continuous growth. This does not mean asceticism. I am the most anti-ascetic person ever, but actually we already live with a lot of technologies and a lot of subjectivities that appreciate things that actually are extremely low cost. Most of the stuff that even so-called advanced developed subjectivities and tastes want now is very easily and cheaply produced. The stuff that's really expensive, frankly, is fossil fuel-based energy, air travel. There's a couple, you can go down a list, I have charts and other things. But that's the world of slowing down. It doesn't mean living with hair suits and eating turnips all the time. And finally, that brings me to anarchism. I think there's an interesting debate between a lot of anarchists who rightly criticize a lot of sort of super excited and exuberant communists for saying look, come on guys, there's not enough stuff, it's not going to work, it's unsustainable. But at the same time, any sort of feasible, real-term, steady state or planned degrowth economy is exactly that. It is planned. And what does that mean? It means that it has a state. It means there's a state of some kind is there, and not just sovereign states. And I do mean sovereign here and all that ugly word, and that's why I've got our old friend Thomas up there. But probably international bodies, those ugly things, treaty organizations, and these will likely be necessary for any non-die-off based climate change scenario. And I will say there's a growing body of sort of kind of primitivist literature that talks about, sort of the challenges of the Anthropocene. They're almost all die-off scenarios. And if you think about which 6 billion people are going to die off in the die-off scenario, I know which 6 billion. That's the Rex Tillerson position, I have to say, right? He knows everything I've said in this thing, someone like that. But he knows he's going to be safe. Deepesh Chakrabarty made this claim, there's no lifeboats. Nah, that's not true. Rex Tillerson has a lifeboat. There are winners in the climate change scenario. Just most of us aren't in the category. So that is, I'll stop there. Like I said, it's part of a bigger project, but that's all I have to say. Okay. So I'll transition from talking to asking. I think I'm going to do almost the opposite of what last night, we had our opening panel, and I tried to sort of stitch everyone together. I almost want to ask you all ever so slightly different questions, if you don't mind. And then and then if you have also questions for each other, please. And actually, Kate, I think I want to start with you because I want to hear more. You were talking about clearly I caught my ear because I was like, yes. I also love Tim Mitchell's book on, it's the most accidentally Marxist book of all time. He doesn't consider it a Marxist book, but it's literally this is how you form a proletariat. But I would love to hear more about, because you stopped right before you were talking about Puerto Rico, and you stopped right, and he does have so much to say about the formation of post-colonial states, and I just want to hear a little bit more about the story of colonialism in this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually I was on a reporting trip in Puerto Rico this past week, and so it's kind of on my mind. So I think I'll focus mostly on Puerto Rico and not pretend to be a scholar of post-colonialism. But yeah, I mean, Puerto Rico is a really interesting place to think through these questions, in part because there really aren't fossil fuels there. So like most island nations, Puerto Rico is heavily dependent on oil. They've gotten upwards of 90% of their fuel from oil for most of the 20th century. There's a little bit of coal, very, very little bit of renewables. And kind of what has happened in the last couple of years is, I think, kind of goes back to something Michelle was talking about, is that when there isn't when there aren't sort of fossil fuels to extract, there are new sort of frontiers that the logic of extraction that fuels capitalism and has fueled sort of empire for a long time sort of seek out new venues. And so in Puerto Rico, that has been sort of financial extraction for a long time. And so for much of the 20th century, after Puerto Rico became a territory, was treated as sort of a tax haven for corporations. And so there were these very generous federal tax breaks, which expired in 2006 and plunged the economy into a very, very deep recession that it's still in. And so almost overnight, unemployment skyrocketed, the bond rating for Puerto Rico plummeted, and in steps Wall Street and says, we will negotiate these forms of lending, which will let you exceed your borrowing limit, which will let you take out more bonds, and will basically let you rewrite sort of financial regulations. And so Wall Street banks, most of the big players, Citibank is big in this, Santander, I think Goldman Sachs is I'm forgetting the exact names of the banks, but sort of the big players, who you would think of as being these folks, step in sort of after the financial crisis, like sort of compounds the ongoing recession in Puerto Rico, and engineer these forms of debt which are probably illegal. There hasn't been an audit of the debt. That kind of was a big demand before Hurricane Maria hit, and very quickly, the sort of ruling government in Puerto Rico stopped any audit of the debt that was likely to be put on the table. But Wall Street steps in, makes most of its money actually underwriting bonds to US-based hedge funds and mutual funds. There's some other players in there too, but drives the country into $74 billion in debt. I think I'm getting the billion right there, and including on things like PREPA, on the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, which is this sort of actually holdover from the New Deal public utility corporation, which has sort of remarkable reach in the sort of landscape of island power utilities. Basically everywhere is electrified. The infrastructure is aged. It's, in some cases very, has not been updated since the 1950s, but is really sort of wide-ranging in terms of how far it reaches into many parts of the island, including places that are hard to access. And so there's this sort of like horrible, Christian Parenti uses this term, this sort of catastrophic convergence, and it's maybe a version of that, which is, basically like all these things sort of come together at once. And so when Hurricane Maria hits, there have already been like successive hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico, right? There's colonialism going back hundreds of years. There's a sort of financial, vulture funds that have come in, various just sort of taking and taking and taking and taking. And so the storm comes in, and then it's just the island is and the governing structures sort of overseeing the island are totally unable to respond. And so this sort of goes back, it's hard to like look at any one origin point for this, right? It like keeps sort of going back. And so I think there's this sort of way that like extraction is so deeply embedded into a colonial project, and sort of the worst, you see the worst impacts in places that are, like Puerto Rico is, a colony. And so it just so happens that many of the places that are most likely to be worst hit by climate change are already being worst hit by climate change, are either in colonial relationships like Puerto Rico, or post-colonial states, or places that have had resources sort of just taken from them historically, and been really stopped from developing in ways that would be resilient to climate change. There's much more to say about that.
No,
but.
it's brilliant. I mean, I mean, it's not nothing on this is like particularly like uplifting. But I was gonna say it's the perfect sort of setup in some ways, because there is a thread, right, running through, I think, what everyone's talking about here. And I'm thinking in particular of, Michelle, what you were talking about of extraction and how you make sites for extraction. And colonization is one of those things. But Michelle, I wanted to give you a chance because it seemed like you wanted to, like, there was a connection, right? There's resource extraction, there's data extraction. And I think this colonial relationship might be illuminating, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, well, I was thinking when you were talking about West Virginia as also a source of resource extraction, I grew up there. My whole family's still there. I'm very connected. And I think a lot about the ways in which I think that the reason I'm sort of obsessed with making claims on the wealth generated from data extraction is that I grew up in a place where, like, we made no claims on the wealth generated from our resource extraction. We had a union that made wage claims on some income shares, but not on wealth. And so I think that, like, if we can really start thinking about, I think you're right, that, like, when all of the hard natural resources are extracted, then capital just figures out another way to, like, keep taking and not giving back, and that we have to be really thoughtful about when we're making demands, that we're not making demands on, like, the profit of the long-term the end product of the extraction, but the methodologies of the extraction, and, like, what is the other wealth generated from the systems that are built to pool whatever those resources are, and whatever. And if you look at the ways in which technology, what we see of tech, and specifically artificial intelligence, is like kind of like just this magical process. But in many post-colonial places around the world, there are these large farms of people who are working day in and day out on computers to actually they're performing the labor of that magic. So, like, you type a thing in that you're finding and you think that the machine, like, went and found it for you, but actually there's someone in the Philippines or in sub-Saharan Africa or in India who's going and looking for it and getting it for you. And they are completely unrecognized and completely uncompensated. And so there are so many places in almost that supply chain of delivery where we could be organizing workers or disrupting the ways in which that is currently designed, and where we could be reallocating that wealth that we're not doing. And a lot of those places sort of line up with all of the other histories of extraction and debasement brought on by capital.
And this is, again, a very, very good pivot to this sort of question. There's this tension, right, between the sort of technology not as a neutral medium, right, but as an expression of social relations, but also of limitations, right? We want to think dialectically, but we also have a kind of, there's not just a both and, like a classic Hegel, there's also an either or, and some of that's coming up here. And this is where I think the low modernist vision, like I'm curious to hear more of that and how that fits in this sort of weird tension.
So high modernism is the kind of, very progress and science-oriented, I guess, both ideology and set of projects. It's like, using technology and science to dominate nature is like the great human enterprise, and we should do that as much as we can, and so on. I actually have some slides if people want to see more slides. I'll throw up. And I think this has actually been, sorry, one sec. How do I enter? I don't use PowerPoint usually, so Can I get that? Okay, great. So, like, I think in terms of, like, I mean, to the question of the state and what the state does, I think that when people think about using the state, it tends to be this very, like, okay, let's, like, build the Hoover Dam. Let's do, like, I mean, or, like, the TVA, and this is, you know, this is from the TVA website. It's, like, built for the people, like, the big dam that's, like, the project that will harness science and technology for, like, the service of the public in some way. And I mean, I don't know if people saw this Rachel Maddow commercial on MSNBC, but where she's like in front of the Hoover Dam and like, this is what it means to think about. We have to figure out whether there's still a country that can think this big, and like that's what using, you know, like the nation or the state or whatever it is to like think big and build this gigantic like concrete thing. And I think, you know, so I'm trying to think about like, what other kinds of imaginaries we can have about like how to use technology and the state, which I agree is necessary, but like without just saying, okay, and so let's go out and dominate and like, you know, build these huge things. And, you know, people have made criticisms, ecological criticisms of dams. Certainly, for a long time, there have been a ton of like ecological movements around dams or against dams, and people are starting to like take them down and so on. But I think there are also other, you know, these are obviously New Deal era projects, but they're not the only ones. And I actually get the term low modernism from Just Gilbert, who wrote a book about what he calls like agrarian democracy and the Soil Conservation Service, which is one of the New Deal efforts to repair some of the harm done by agricultural overproduction and like post-Dust Bowl kind of ecological restoration. And there were different versions of it, but one of the things he's interested in is this soil conservation district programs where they try to organize farmers and importantly, not just landowners, which a lot of other New Deal agricultural programs were oriented towards, but tenant farmers as well, which was really important because, you know, like working class and especially black farmers were left out of a lot of landowner projects. They did not own land, but in collectively managing land within like a watershed or some kind of naturally bounded area rather than county lines, and to try to do this as like a project that had, you know, like state employed experts, but also people who were working the land, working together to what he calls economic democracy in agriculture. And so it wasn't kind of just like the planners coming in and saying, all right, this is how it works, like get with the program. And nor was it just kind of like the farmers know everything and so they can just do, you know, it was kind of trying to manage different kinds of knowledge and across within like an ecologically bounded space and so on. I think it's an interesting example. I also think that there are other ways to, you know, I actually do think we are going to need some like big, high modernist-esque stuff, but I think it should not be the only imaginary, and I think that when we think about it, it maybe could be applied to things like housing. So I think like the Barbican in London, I love, I don't know if people have been there or seen pictures of it, but it's this very like huge, like very modernist housing, like concrete, brutalist, whatever housing project, but there's also like a big, you know, like, yeah, I love brutalism, I'm sorry, but like.
Yeah, me too.
But there's also, you know, there's like there's tons of like, you know, parks and plants, and there's like this big artificial lake, and they have a bunch of, you know, it's tons of cultural programming. You can go see like a play and go see symphonies, and you can have this whole, it's just a huge social project. It's very utopian. You're just like, oh, I can go here and do all of these kinds of, you know, I think as all of us have talked about in some way, more like leisurely kinds of activities, and it's using this big scale thing, or like Vienna social housing has this like also very beautiful kind of green, like modernist thing. And so I think thinking about like how we can use, I guess like selectively use high modernism and also try to like, but more generally aim towards instead of just like high tech eco-socialism, like low key eco-socialism. You know, I always think of like the, I know, you know, Marx's famous description of communism and the German ideology, where you go and you hunt in the morning and fish in the afternoon and rear cattle in the evening and criticize after dinner. Like, it's very, he's like interacting with other species in all of these. I mean, admittedly, he's trying to kill them in a couple, but maybe we can update that and, you know, bird watch in the morning and snorkel in the afternoon, and he can still criticize after dinner, as Marxists are wont to do. But I don't know if people saw this, well, this is my favorite, Meryl Laderman Euclid, who does maintenance art, but, and people saw the New York Times, like, spread of, like, pictures from the 70s of, like, people hanging out in parks in the 70s that they just rediscovered, but I really love them, because I think they're what Daniel Cohen, who's in the audience here, calls low-carbon leisure, and it's, like, very, and I think these are also very, like, low modernism technologies, like a boombox, a Frisbee, like things where you can go out and have like a nice leisurely fun time and hang out with other people and have like the kind of good life within planetary boundaries we're talking about. This is also nice because you have the kind of like UFO-esque like Frisbee imagery. Anyway, so that's how I think about, I guess, trying to navigate these questions and like how and where we can use the state to do that, so.
So, cool. So questions. We'll take like in bunches. We'll take a couple each, around. Do you want to?
Thank you. That was a really interesting set of talks. Really enjoyed all the talks. My question is, number one, to you, when you make this analogy between extraction in its physical material guise and the algorithmic virtual world extraction, I mean, there's a very important difference that material goods are rival goods, whereas virtual goods are non-rival goods. So if we extract something algorithmically, it doesn't take away from our ability to extract something else or that same thing a second time or by someone else. So I'm wondering if you have thought about, the fact that we kind of require some kind of compensation for our data, how that would actually work in practice, given that some other entity made up of perhaps a cooperative or a collective of ourselves might also be interested in extracting data for the common good as well. And my question to Ajay was, I'm wondering, that this requirement that we have a planned, we plan for the future, number one, that seems to come with an unstated assumption that our long-term survival as a species is important. But we may not all agree on that. I mean, we might simply think that it is better to burn the candle at both ends. Why should it matter? And maybe it occurs to me that perhaps the reason that this unstated assumption is there is because of the humanism, that underlies so much of Marx, that the human being is important and different and special in some sense. But it seems to me that if we are willing to mandate this kind of social control, that we would have some kind of planning, and no matter what, you will be dragged kicking and screaming into complying with that plan, then why not simply enforce mandatory population control? I mean, if we are willing to tolerate that kind of authoritarianism, then we don't need to have 7 million people jostling for space on the planet, and we can similarly mandate, enforce reduction of population.
So this question is inspired by Ajay having mentioned that the ecological crisis is, in many respects, also a crisis of gendered labor. And to the authors that were already cited in the presentation, I want to add Vandana Shiva, who is an Indian socialist feminist, and I would say also an ecological feminist. And my question in thinking about her is if all of you could say more about how you see gender as a part of the terrain that we're discussing here, the contradictions of gender, and the potentials for a truly intersectional, truly global feminist movement, and what that kind of socialist feminist ecology would look like.
Thanks. I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has thoughts about the way your comments relate to the way that neoliberalism, or whatever we want to call the contemporary condition, subjectivizes individuals as them personally being responsible for transforming the climate or stopping or leaving less of a carbon footprint. I'm thinking, for example, of recycling as something that really places the onus on the individual to do better, or to buy an electric car rather than a normal car. But rather than talking about how these transformative policies and these huge carbon footprints are actually not being left by individuals, but by these gigantic companies that have much more of an impact on our environment.
The first one was directly to you, Michelle.
Yeah, so on the question around compensation for data, I kind of have two ways of thinking about it. There's the very specific current way that we could imagine it, which is like why I start with the workplace, because there's a pre-existing economic relationship between the entity extracting the data and the person that is having the data taken from them, and that is to claim some of the wealth generated, more of the wealth generated from their productivity. So like you use information that I deliver to you through the automated system that I use while I'm working, and you gain more productivity from it. So I mean, it's like very basic. But if we're looking in the long term, what I think is more interesting is, so data really actually only works in aggregate and as the commons. And so a lot of folks have talked quite a bit about how most of the giant tech platforms and tech monopolies are essentially municipal systems. They kind of function as public utilities. And so if you imagine a circumstance in which you're thinking about Google as a public utility, then the data is commonly owned, and the aggregate value of the data goes back to the culture. Like, you're able to use Google without the ads because the use of the data is going back into building a system that is commonly owned by all people, which I think is actually, like, in the short term, the individual claims on productivity from data is more of like setting up a mental framework for thinking differently about the fact that you are producing value through your participation in these systems, but it gets you to a long-term imagining of like, my participation creates value. In aggregate, it's even more valuable. Could we all be sharing in that at an aggregate level?
The second set of questions were given to me, but I'm happy to share. but I'll say quickly, yes, you're absolutely right. There's in that sort of jargon that is both academic jargon and also sort of activist jargon, I am centering humans. This morning a little bit we talked about sort of humanism, anti-humanism, and I would say, like, I think part of this project for me is critical humanism, and it does privilege human survival. And I'm like okay with that. There is a vast literature, and there's a lot of people, and I'm not 100% dismissive of it, because like maybe that that super grim thing to me is actually like the optimistic version, because like most likely actually it's insoluble and we all die. But like, or not all of us, everyone but Rex Tillerson. But no, but like there is a large and interesting, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of it, literature about like, yeah, like why bother? Like maybe we should be stoic about it and just kind of suck it up and die. Maybe we should, the coral reef and us are of equal weight, and there's not really a lot of argument you can make against that. And like, why should we last and it not? So like, I will openly say there is a meta-ethical position here that privileges human survival. And I don't know how to get around that. That said, the mandatory population thing, I think, is it's funny that I just saw that new Avengers movie, right? Like there is like a kind of super weird. It is a Baconian logic, and in addition to a Malthusian one. No, it's like, well, if we get rid of half of all the life everywhere, then people will be happier, right? Because there will be more stuff to spread around. I mean, it's something incredibly intuitive about it. I think one of the things I was trying to get at with my little like cyborg circuit example is actually like that would just have the same stressors on a smaller scale. So perhaps maybe the carbon stuff is a little bit down, but it's still pretty shit. And the second point, it comes back to the critical humanism, which is I'm pretty sure that like this is not a heroic story. And I do think some people try to spin this as a heroic story where like, it's sort of like the good version of Mad Max or something. And like the survival people are super awesome. But like I said, the survival people probably have like probably like the actual Mad Max thing. It's like big private armies on resource hoarding, which is kind of already what it is. People read Octavia Butler books, like the world is just kind of Octavia Butler books. Like it's like, and that's not great. And that's not like it's the future world. That's the now. The last two were the sort of ecology and gender, which I'm happy to answer, but probably one of you should answer, and neoliberalism. Yeah, go. Yeah, there you go.
I mean, that's actually, I think, that the population question is a great segue into the gender question, because I think this is the way that, I think of gender as being very central to the way I think about ecological political economy and so on. And, you see this in a number of people, like Maria Mies and Jason Moore, and people have made these arguments that are like saying that both the unwaged work of households and of many kinds of women's work are also, or social reproduction is also is analogous to ecological reproduction, and I use a very similar framework. And I think Vandana Shiva has written things with Maria Mies, and they're in a similar place. And I'll say something, something about Shiva in a minute, but I do find it always sort of depressing that the way that these kinds of, instead of like reproducers of the world unite, you get this kind of like the way to solve like the ecological regeneration crisis is to like limit reproductive freedoms, and to, you have to pit the reproducers against each other instead of figuring out the like social, ecological, reproductive future that we would, I think, have all described in various ways wanting to live in. And so, I'm trying to understand more about this, and you can see it kind of happening in the 70s when both of these discourses are emerging. And so you get like Garrett Hardin, whose entire argument about the tragedy of the commons is about how the welfare state licenses over too much reproduction, and doesn't just people aren't limited to whatever children they can support. And Garrett Hardin, the tragedy, he wrote if you've heard the tragedy of the commons phrase, he popularized this phrase, and the article is really atrocious, both ideologically and as a piece of social science. It's just half of it is made up, and but he's really explicitly saying that the welfare state is the reason for overpopulation and so on. But so I think you see this coming out in various ways, and it's really I find it depressing. So I would like to figure out how contemporary socialists and communists and Marxists can figure out how to not repeat that. I think the personal responsibility, well, I guess I'll say one brief thing about Shiva, which is that I think she's done really amazing work to often remind us of the ways that things like biotech and so on can be sites of renewed primitive accumulation and so on, and the ways that Monsanto's seed control can dispossess Indian peasants of their livelihoods and so on. I do think sometimes she can shade a bit into a more anti-technology stance than I would personally like. I tend to fall with Donna Haraway on these things, and in my Cyborgs for Earthly Survival pin, which is forever my slogan. I also liked because these beings of the biosphere unite, so we can maybe figure out a new one. But so I think we should just try to keep that in mind. And on the personal responsibility, I do think there's both the question of thinking about collective consumption rather than just individualizing it, and that's very important. And that consumption and production you cannot think about separately, and it's we can't just say consumers, especially given that the American consumer household was created to absorb production, and then it's oh, consumers, why are you consuming so much? It's really maddening. But I think there's also some things that make me nervous in reading some of the ecological literature. If you read, I don't know if people have read Barry Commoner, but I think wrote about, was writing about ecology from a left perspective in the 70s, and he has his 4 laws of ecology, and one of them is no such thing as a free lunch, which he admits he takes from economics, and it's supposed to describe this problem that you're mentioning, that you can't just come up with more cadmium from somewhere, and it's right in many ways, but I think the ways that it's also a neoliberal slogan that you can't get something for nothing, there's no free stuff, all of this has become transmuted into the language of you can't have free public goods because someone's paying for them, and it's rich people.
Apples do grow on trees.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So I think we need to figure out, I don't know, maybe we need some new language around this, but I think there's been a blurring of this kind of like, we need to account for all the costs, which I think is right, and capitalism can't actually account for all its costs and be profitable. But like that's become, instead of a way to hold capital to account, become like a way to like discipline individual people as consumers and who are trying to get about their lives. So I would like to, I'm still thinking through this myself, but I think that's a really crucial thing for us to do.
Kate, did you want to?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, to hop onto that, I think there's a real language of austerity that kind of pervades many different parts of the climate debate. And this comes from like everything from like bike more to work, these sort of like individual lifestyle choices, which are great. It might make your life better if you bike more to work. Will it have a like world historic impact on parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere? Probably not. And that's, I think it's hard to sort of decouple that from just the way that like neoliberalism has so sort of totally captured the policy debate, in particular on climate change, and really sort of, it's interesting to look at sort of like the development of the green movement, right? And that the 70s sort of, you had these activist lawyers going out and like suing states to like protect these like obscure bird species, and then by doing that, protect like huge swaths of land, and really doing this like really interesting like activist lawyer work, which was making claims of the state, right? Which was making these really interesting things, and the Clean Air Act comes out of that, the Clean Water Act comes out of that. These really powerful laws that actually today give us a lot of power to regulate carbon, and have given us this really powerful regulatory framework. And that sort of starts to fade away as neoliberalism rises. And so, you have people who are like members of the Mont Pelerin Society in the 1970s talking about how we should be taxing pollution. And then that has just become sort of common logic among even people like Bernie Sanders, right? Around like even sort of like center-left figures. And there's nothing, I think a carbon tax is a good idea. I think it should happen. It's common sense. But there's a way in which like the sort of neoliberal project, which, is multifaceted. There are many different parts to it. But I think a really, maybe the through line of it is that the market is sort of all knowing, that the market is the best means of assessing information, of processing information, and of giving people, the information for how to live their lives. And that has just totally captured the climate debate, and I think has gone a little bit unquestioned, in part because of how far the climate debate has been from the left historically, and that a lot of folks in the green movement don't necessarily, have the language to talk about that. And so, you get these very sort of neoliberal solutions that to talk to, like policymakers about this stuff. And I've interviewed, folks who I think are very well intentioned, but there's just the realm of imagination is just so small in terms of what they can think about. And that's for a lot of reasons, in part because of these, really specific ways that neoliberalism has shaped our conversation about economic policy. It's just I don't think it's necessarily anyone's. Well, it's like neoliberalism and capitalism's fault, right? But I don't necessarily blame policymakers in the here and now for working with a very limited set of tools when there really has not been very much on the table, and the intellectual infrastructure around climate thought in particular is just so weak, and that there just are very few think tanks or very few sort of people writing white papers for what a holistic transformation away from fossil fuels will look like. And the people who are writing those papers are like in the American Enterprise Institute and in like Brookings and in these sort of like center-right institutions who, AEI has been writing papers about climate change for like 15 years and writing about geoengineering for like, years and years and years. And I think the left sort of policy infrastructure is not quite caught up to that. And so what we get is this sort of, everything from individual to just rote market-based solutions.
Yeah, just super quick, on the sort of ecology, gender. I mean, this came up last night, right? Like, I think, and we've come up a few times here, like you can't just sort of staple things on together. And sometimes the way in which gender is discussed in Marxian conversations is like, oh, there's also social reproduction. And there's a way in which the climate conversation is like social reproduction is the primary thing. Like the other forms of production are part of social reproduction, not vice versa. So that's just a quick one on there. The question about consumption choices, which is in fact the way, and individual behaviors. I'm not scared of the N-word, neoliberalism. There's other N-words. There's like this popular, now insane discourse that this doesn't mean anything. You should really, like, people who believe that this word doesn't mean anything should tell the IMF, because they use it in their working papers all the time. And part of the way in which it says is, right, we sort our meaningful choices through market mechanisms. And of course, the climate sort of lens of climates, but this is true for like basically everything, is very illuminating on this example, because there's, I always get in trouble when I say this, but I'll totally fucking say it. Your consumption choices have no political significance whatsoever. If you maybe join a boycott movement, if you join a cooperative distribution movement, if like something, you can make it, you can amplify these things. But like when you go to a store and choose to buy one thing or another, it has no political meaning. It might make you feel good, and I actually believe in people feeling good. That's why, like, I'm actually scared of the sort of aesthetic side of the climate story. And maybe making you feel good gets you to do other stuff, but in the end, the story that those things are political is just untrue. More questions, yeah.
I have a couple of targeted questions. So the first one is for Kate. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Venezuela and like maybe how the social welfare policies that they had were based and linked to the petrostate. And so like maybe are there any lessons there about welfare, and like how do you have leftist policies? Maybe if there is anything that you know about it or how it can be linked to. No, okay. And then for Ajay, you mentioned climate displacement, and I wonder if you could expand on that. And you mentioned climate displacement, and if you could expand on maybe like that seems to be a burden that has to be carried by the global south and not so.
So last night we had a really interesting conversation about forgetting and the work of capitalism in forcing forgetting. And listening to y'all talk, especially about what a good low carbon life might be, I've been thinking about how the teachers' movement is a way in which women are doing both the work of challenging petro-driven austerity in those particular states and doing the socially reproductive work of remembering and driving that conversation. And so I wondered if you could think some about that.
I would like maybe comment, maybe somehow to make it a question about these utopian ecological buildings. It's, do we account for all consequences that we choose, which species, which trees, what actually we choose. For example, there is, right now we have this epidemic with Lyme disease. The cause is only one. We choose deers over wolves because, unfortunately, nature is brutal. Nature is unfair, and deer who has disease has to die as soon as possible. But evolution created this balance for a million years, and we like for 2 years building these buildings, choosing trees, then we don't have any flies, any frogs, anything, and we kind of don't really think about what kind of consequences all these utopian buildings would produce.
Does that? Is there one? Is there one more? Yeah. Okay.
Way back.
Hi, I am sort of like two questions. They're sort of connected. The first question is, what is the left or response to obviously the ecological crisis? It's going to cause a huge existential crisis for the concept of a nation state. So do we have an answer for something like this? And second, you mentioned the dire issue of our ecological problem and how it's also related to technology. We do have the capacity to solve some of these issues with the technology, as you said, but because it's not profitable, we don't implement it. So how do we get around this when we have to, when we're thinking about intellectual property rights, patents and stuff? How are we able to get around this? And is there a compromise for people that are innovative and creative on trying to figure out a way that works out for the entire society and being able to at least get value for our labor?
Who's taking what? Is anyone taking Venezuela? Okay.
I would just say I don't know very much about Venezuela, so will not get myself into trouble or just drone on about things I can't speak to. So I wish I did. I will say that the thread that I think is maybe true there, from what I understand of it, and has been present in the teacher strikes that I was talking about in sort of resource-heavy states, is that tying an economy, good or bad, one that is fairly redistributive or one that is not very redistributive, to a fuel source which is inherently incredibly volatile, like oil, is just, I think, has been proven over and over again not to make very much sense. And so as those fuel sources are set to sunset, hopefully that will make less and less sense. And so, just to reiterate what I said before, that we really need to think of new ways for new funding sources for a robust safety net. In terms of the role of women in sort of challenging sort of petro-driven austerity, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the protagonists of these fights have been women, almost, not entirely, certainly. It's not only women who are teachers, but it is a predominantly female workforce. And I think that's, I think Alyssa has probably done more work on this kind of front than I can speak to too well. But I think there is sort of a new vision really being crafted, and I think what's interesting about it is it's sort of a new idea of what a green job entails, right? It's we think of a green job as being hoisting wind turbines or putting solar panels or these huge infrastructure projects. But there are plenty of jobs like teaching, which are not carbon intensive and are really good for the planet. I think encourage a really different way of thinking about what valuable work entails. And I think, sometimes the conversation about the job guarantee, for instance, has orbited around what does really productive work look like? And, that could be public archiving. That could be something like the Federal Theater Project as part of the WPA. It's give people jobs writing plays or acting in plays. There was some oversight hearing for WPA projects in New York, where one of the people who was really critical of it was well, you're doing these you're creating an archive of a Jewish encyclopedia. It's wow, that's great work, and there are all these things that were considered really unproductive, but that are, as we're thinking about it today, low carbon work and sort of expanding the range. People don't need to be producing widgets in order to have jobs. People can be paid to do all kinds of work, which is socially remunerative and can make people's lives better. And so I think, the teachers, I think, are showing us is that, there is really valuable work in sort of looking toward that, and maybe, thinking of striking teachers as low carbon protagonists, to borrow from my friend Daniel Cohen's work on that front. And in terms of, just quickly, nation states, I think borders are the thing that comes to mind in there, and sort of challenging how climate change challenges us to think about nation states. We will, really need to change the way we think about immigration, and having those two conversations are not separate conversations. They haven't been historically, and more people are going to be sort of crossing borders than have at any point in human history as a result of climate change. And so I think like having whether that's open borders, however we want to think about it, but there needs to be a radically different conversation about what border security looks like and what borders themselves do.
The displacement question, which is the perfect follow-up to that, because I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be these there have to be, and there will be tremendous challenges to the sort of nation-state model. And in the same way that Kate was talking about, the American Enterprise Institute is like way out ahead on this, like in terms of like writing papers on it. We talked this morning ever so slightly a bit about the EU, right? Like, and people rail at the EU and complain about the EU, and they rightly should. The left doesn't like to talk about what its version, like, I mean, I know Yanis Varoufakis says his one thing that no one else believes in, but like we don't like to talk about what our international framework with existing states would look like. My personal suspicion on this, especially on the displacement question, is both like, there are going to be like it's basically a foregone conclusion at this point. There are certain places on Earth that are currently quite socially important and also quite populated. So Pakistan is a very good example. The Arabian Peninsula is another really interesting example of this. A place that probably within our lifetimes it will be very difficult to walk around in. Think about what that means for 1 billion something Muslims in the world. But that we'll probably need a vague international framework that might start to think about from a more left perspective might be something like greater mobility, if not entirely, and I actually would be for complete free mobility, and greater controls and greater planning, again, I know it's a dirty word, on where capital is moving, right? Because part of this story, right, if we decrease our consumption choices magically or something like this, and which actually has happened in certain parts of Europe, it just pops up in Bangladesh, in China, in other places. And I do think that will be an existential crisis, as someone said back there, but I think it's one that I'm not scared of that crisis. I think the right will use it as a weapon of nationalism, and that's why we must articulate a better vision. The only other thing I'll say on this, because I feel like you should take the utopian buildings, because that's 100%. The site of historical memory being a gendered site for the teacher strike is totally fascinating. And actually, you know more about it than I do. But right, there was this, one of you might know this even better than I do, right? The bandana symbol?
The red, the red bandanas that the women in West Virginia wore were from the early mine wars back at the beginning of the 20th century, which, by the way, I only know about, even though I grew up there, because my grandma told me about them, and not because I learned them in school, because we weren't allowed to learn them in school. But yeah, I mean, that was a really direct recall to what was happening. And most of the first counties that went out on strike in the West Virginia teachers' strike were the southern counties like Logan and Mingo and McDowell, and those were also the sites where the uprisings took place in the early 1900s, and so it was a direct callback to that. While I have the mic, if I can talk about forgetting, I loved that question a lot, and it also, West Virginia related, made me think about like, a couple years ago, there was an article in the New York Times by this woman, Annie Lowry, who had gone to, I think she went to visit like McDowell or one of our southern counties, and it seemed kind of bleak there, and so she was like, shouldn't the government just pay everyone to leave because they could go get jobs other places? And there were a lot of us that were enraged at that suggestion because it was essentially an act of forgetting. Like, well, the place is done, so like you should just like, and of course the only important thing you can do is work. And so like, and a lot of discussion took place among like Appalachians and Appalachian diaspora people about like the value in people staying to hang on to a culture that existed, and that if you leave, you are essentially letting the coal companies ultimately win because you're leaving behind that culture. And also, a lot of times when I've worked at home, when we talk about sustainability efforts or reclaiming land, it is often it's spoken in the language of reclaiming the old ways, like, and so the use of memory and the refusal to forget or sort of ancestral practices is actually directly connected to thinking about the value of a mountain versus the value of a job when you're forced to do that, because often your grandparents are buried there. So anyway, I definitely agree that capital relies on forgetting, and that there are all of these ways in which we see the value of cultural memory to preserve things coming up, and it's actually quite a natural urge for people that tends to come into a lot of movement building work that we do.
Yeah, I'll get to the utopian buildings, et cetera, question in 1 second. Just have one short thing to add to this. I mean, I completely agree with everything you've all said about the work of remembering, and how exciting it is to see a new kind of labor movement recalling the history of the old. And, you know, I think that's really great. I think it's like, how can we both think of that as like a remembering and a refuturing or future visioning or something? And like, you know, we don't have to just give coal miners jobs as like solar panel techs. We can give them jobs as teachers or like as nurses working to like, you know, for, I don't know, to heal people's black lung disease. And, you know, there's like a lot of things like that to do. I think always of like you know, so like the Civilian Conservation Corps is one of the kind of also like park building things of the New Deal jobs programs where they, you know, build all these sort of national parks and things. But national parks also have like, there are historical national parks. Like you could do a monuments to labor and the land, whatever. Like you can do these kinds of, you know, things that are remembering like the very rich history of political struggle in this country. So I think there are a lot of exciting potential things there, but I think it's been very, and I think, I mean, even just remembering how many people are already doing this work, like the pictures people saw, I don't know if people saw those pictures from Arizona where all of the teachers were out like in the streets, and it was this humongous wave of red of teachers wearing, you know, their red shirts and like out in the streets, and you're like, this is not like a side, you know, thing. This is, you know, there are a lot of people doing this work, and we should pay attention to that. So, but on to the question of, you know, what to, I guess the consequences, unintended. I guess I took there to being a few different questions, and those are concerns you have about, I guess, like the consequences of sort of trying to make ecological choices and what kinds of unintended consequences there are. And I think maybe there are a couple of different things going on there. And one is around, I guess, like the utopian buildings of things like the Barbican or something, where certainly, you know, I think in those somebody is selecting like what trees are we planting and like what is this, you know, kind of created landscape and so on. And I think, you know, the more that reflects what the people who are going to be living there would like to live around, the better that would be. And I think some of the sort of like, you know, the planning, like democratic agrarianism in this like low modernism book I was mentioning, I think is actually an interesting way to think about some of that. But that's, I think, a slightly different thing than the question of thinking of doing that on a planetary scale in terms of global ecology, right? So like there's one that's, okay, building things. And you know, anything we build is going to have an environmental impact. I think there's no way around that. And it's important to recognize that, but not expect that there can be you know, you're not going to build like a big housing project and have it be like impact-free or something. And I think that it's important to recognize that and think about what those are and be conscious of the choices we're making, because we always are making choices about how we are affecting, you know, the planetary ecology in which we live. And if you look around, that is already going haywire. As you know, there are like Lyme disease is spreading because of the warming of the planet. Species are moving as like the temperature boundary in which they can live is moving. And that's been happening before, it's not only related to climate change, it's also related to the global economy and the, species are stowaways on ships and so on. But like there have been, this is often described as invasive species, which is a controversial term because it's like, where are species supposed to only belong in one place? Who knows? But they have certainly moved outside of the places that they usually live because of, global trade and the like material infrastructure and movement that goes along with that. And so I don't think that we can avoid thinking about these things. Like we do not live in a world, we have to be, I think, already conscious of that. The first economist hired by the U.S. government was an economic ornithologist, which was economic ornithology is basically studying birds according to whether they call it like according to like monetary values, but it's like basically whether birds are good or bad for the economy, and really in the history of like certainly in American. I guess environmental resource policy, whatever, it's always been about oriented towards like what kinds of production you are concerned with. So like, do you kill all the wolves because they're, killing the cattle and cattle ranchers are upset about that? Or are you killing certain kinds of birds because they're eating one farmer's crops versus another kind of bird because they're helpful for, so there are always these questions. And so far we've mostly made them on the basis of like trying to promote different kinds of industry or something, often with quite, disastrous ecological effects, and so this has been the history of and there are always choices to make, and I think some of the like there's sometimes in thinking about the ethical dimension of whether we value humans above other species, it's I think it is unavoidable on some level to have to make some kinds of decisions if, that like, yes, maybe we don't want people to have Lyme disease. Maybe you eradicate like, or like you're trying to like not have as much like ticks carrying Lyme disease. And like, I'm okay with that. So, I think these are all like important ethical and political questions that we need to be thinking about seriously. And so I guess that's what I would say about that.
Just super quick on something that I think might tie a couple of these things together, and it actually weirdly brings us back to Marx. That question of something that can seem so immaterial, right? The historical transmission of memory. Where is the site of memory? That is, of course, a material process. B, you were talking about like Tim Mitchell's arguments about sort of development of a sort of coal miner subjectivity, and it's not terribly dissimilar from the way in which Marx talks about it in sort of factory conditions, or Engels talks about it in factory conditions. In that story, where it's historical memory doing the work, as opposed to like being shoved into a room or into a like crevasse in a thing, we can think about perhaps other ways in which these political subjects can be formed, which we might need because historically, that thing that Marx calls a proletariat has never actually been a global majority in any particular country or worldwide. And then just the last thing I was thinking of, I can't remember who said it. Someone on this panel said, capitalism can't account for its own costs. And if there's one thing that I would want to like sort of leave on the table for people to think about, is that like leaving, Capitals volume 1 through 3, like on the table, like forgetting that for a moment, like everything, some of the books that we've talked about, some of the articles we've talked about, some of the things, use like mainstream macroeconomic principles, use arguments from liberal democratic theory, use arguments from the inside, which is a classic Marxian position. It's immanent critique. Capitalism cannot, of its own accord, account for its own costs. And I think that's, I don't know what else to say. We are at, so we're going to take a quick coffee break. And then the next panel after this is, at 4 p.m., is the Poetics and Aesthetics of Marx. And so we'll see you back here in a couple minutes. Thank you so much to you all for participating, and thank you guys for listening.